I expect that since everybody in the audience is going to be coming from different backgrounds, you're joining the conversation because you're curious, or because in the future you might be wanting to start your own company, or you might want to manage R&D or commercial and licensing. So I hope the content is interesting for everybody. What you will be taking away is basically three things: understanding how today's companies built on science and or technology operate, what are the success factors for innovation in those companies, and some innovation frameworks. One thing I will be asking everybody is if we want to make this a conversation and making an engaging webinar, I recommend that you use those Twitter hashtags. So BSB Webinar or hashtag Ask Frank Cardels without the C at the end to kind of ask. And I will be taking those questions live and be able to share with everybody. There is a copy of the hashtags at the bottom of the slides. So let's start with what is happening at Silicon Valley. So if we look at the region with the perspective of how it's comparing with the largest research organizations, we see that they're leading the pack. They're basically rivaling the largest research centers and organizations in the world. And not only from a budget perspective, but as well from a perspective of how much staff they're able to pull in. So let's get into a few examples. So the whole of Silicon Valley invests around 30 billion in R&D, and they're employing more than 2,000 scientists. If we put that in perspective with NASA, one of the largest research organizations, they're investing even more. So NASA is only 19 billion, so we can see the difference, employing a similar, very similar headcount. So it's kind of the Silicon Valley scientific approach is almost as large as NASA. But we are not necessarily, or kind of the caveat here in the comparisons that we might be saying, well, but maybe you're including engineering or other knowledge-based activities. Here we're just talking about people with scientist job titles or PhDs. So people working on applied and fundamental research at those companies. And look as well from the perspective of the scale. So we divide the budget versus the amount of people working on those organizations. We can see easily, for example, the 50 million per employee per scientist in Silicon Valley, comparable to the NASA budget, versus maybe lower budget per head in other research centers that we are comparing. And what else is happening with Silicon Valley? So today is the poster child in innovation excellence. Everybody talks about Silicon Valley. And we saw the scale of the investments, but if we look as well at the output of Silicon Valley is when the comparison becomes even more clear. So this is the number of filed patents in 2016, and we can see that Silicon Valley has been the region in the world with the largest number of filed patents per year. So we're over 8,000 patents compared to, for example, the largest global patent applicant incorporate. So one of the largest companies in the world is just producing around a third of that number. And we can go down to the list, and if we put the top 3 research organizations in Europe, we see that is below the 1,000 patents per year. So we can see the scale and how Silicon Valley is impactful in terms of societal impact from the perspective of innovation. But there are some other things that I didn't capture in this slide where Silicon Valley is as well the poster child. So you probably know about the commercial successes, so companies that have a valuation making them being the most valuable companies in the world, or we know as well about the workplace reputation that those companies have. So we know about those companies being in the magazines in terms of how successful and happy employees are working there. So it's a combination of several things that make them outperform everybody. So the question is, what do they do? What is their secret sauce? How is it possible that they're that successful? So I've tried to summarize here, and again, from my perspective and my experience, what are at least the 5 essentials, the 5 things that they are doing, those world's most innovative companies, to be successful. Of course, one of the key questions that we are not covering here is whether we should be becoming one of these most innovative companies. But at least what we are kind of covering is what could be easily brought to our everyday life, to our everyday research, that could make us be a bit more closer to what Silicon Valley is doing. So the first thing that these companies do is have a sticky vision. Let's start first looking at what is a vision. So an innovator presents himself in terms of what is the change they're bringing to the world. And how do they believe the world should be looking like after they have finished this change? And this is something like someone like NASA is very well encapsulating. They're saying that they reach for new heights and reveal the unknown, and for the benefit of humankind. So that's what a vision is. But let's look at a Silicon Valley innovator like a SpaceX and check what is the vision that they're sharing for the world. And in this case, what they're saying is like, we make humankind a multiplanetary species. So compare the two, and which one do you like best? I'm going to be giving a few seconds and see whether you engage in the Twitter and or in the YouTube post, so that we can get whether you have any preference for any of the two and continue the conversation. Give you a few seconds. Okay, so some people might prefer the left one, the NASA one, or some people might prefer the SpaceX one. So that's, of course, a personal preference. But at the end of the day, that's the difference between that's the two different approaches to a vision. And let's see what is different. What are the ingredients of one of these Silicon Valley visions that we call the sticky vision? It's like they try to bring something that is inspirational. They try to bring something that is linked to an exciting future for everybody. So if we look at both our NASA or SpaceX, what they're talking is about something that is really bold, that is massive. That's what we call the audacious. So if something is going to be 10 times better, we're going to be reaching the stars. We're going to be able to leave Earth, which is something that is really, really massive. We have only human beings have only reached the moon. So are we able to go farther from there? Are we going to be able to be an interstellar species? So that's part of the goal, of this big goal. Then there is about the futuristic approach. So it might be possible in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Who knows what is going to be happening? So that's another component that is part of this vision. Last but not least, it's inclusive. So this is for everybody, it's for humankind. That was in the couple of visions that we were seeing. So this package about being bold, being massive, having a futuristic vision, and being inclusive and universal, that's common among the two visions. So, but here's where science stops. So I will probably ask you, have a look at your the vision statements of your universities, research centers, or companies you're working with. So they're probably encapsulating all these three things. What is different for Silicon Valley is that they try to add this couple of other things. So first of all is trying to have a magnetic content in the vision. So something that is like a mantra, something that you cannot stop repeating. It's like, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to be an interstellar species. We're going to be able to leave Earth, or we're going to go closer to the stars. That's something really magnetic, at least for a few people. So it has like spiritual powers. It's something similar to that. What about the aspect of being engaging? So the idea is that this is not for just the customers. It's as well for employees. It's as well for investors. It's something that makes everybody in a similar way make decisions to reach that end goal. So this is the two additional things that we bring to the vision, the additional ingredients that most of these Silicon Valley companies have. And I'm reading here in the Twitter feed that many people in the YouTube chat think that SpaceX vision is better. So thanks for the feedback. Now the question would be, could you think about any companies that you admire, or any products or services that you usually buy, and check their vision statement? So I'll give you maybe a few seconds to Google it and think, hey, I like it. It's connected to what you just discussed in terms of the sticky vision. And if you could share it, again, either in the YouTube chat or in Twitter, wherever you prefer, and we can continue the conversation. So I'll leave you for a few seconds, find those companies that you admire, find their vision, and just share it. Okay, so while you look for that vision and you share it, let me move to another example. So CERN has a vision that, as we discussed, covers most of these points. So their vision statement is to gain understanding of the most fundamental particles and laws of the universe. So that's something future thinking. Someday we'll be able to understand all the fundamentals of the physics and the laws of the universe. So, and that's something that is beneficial for everybody, and it's pretty ambitious. It's very, very ambitious. So kind of here the question is, how could we improve this vision? How could we make it different? Maybe a little bit stickier. Leave you as well a few seconds to think about it and see whether you want to share any ideas or any thoughts in terms of how we could be making it magnetic. So I'm getting some feedback from the YouTube chat. So it seems that some of you are suggesting that Telegram's vision could be one example. So let's move forward in terms of the CERN vision. Let me share, again, this is an interpretation, but could be an approach to make it magnetic. So one example, it could be related to subatomic science. That's what we do. Or we are rebuilding the world we live from the bottom up, from the fundamentals. We will be able to change matter or change the way matter is put together. Or we are just solving the biggest mysteries of the smallest of the universes. So those are, again, things that are different from one possible approach to the kind of the Silicon Valley one. So that's about the vision. Here we have some questions or suggestions. So using, in this case, instead of gain understanding, explaining or using. Great feedback. So let's move into the second essential, the second ingredient of what Silicon Valley is doing in terms of innovation. So we discussed about the vision, that compelling magnetic vision that is kind of bringing everyone behind. But what about what they're actually betting on? What is the type of opportunities they are being focusing on? So that's what we call the explosive bets. And why are we calling them explosive? Just look at the chart. This is the example of Google's first 8 years. So they were founded, or let's say the project started in 96. And for the first couple of years, basically, you don't see much of revenue or activity. Everything was behind the scenes. Then 4 years later is when you see, according to this chart, profits, or let's say they have a significant volume of sales. So it took them basically 6 years from the start to be in a position where you would be saying, well, there's a company. It's basically they're making some money, they can pay the bills. So basically they're doing decent. But the incredible thing is what happens over the next 2 years. So you see that basically they take off. Their revenues multiply by 10 in just 2 years. And this is amazing. Doesn't happen everywhere, things like that. And this is what we call the exponential cycle. That's the type of things that Silicon Valley invests in. So they're basically looking for opportunities where a cycle like this exponential one is going to happen. And basically, most of the companies, and as we'll discuss in a minute, there are some other effects that take this approach. And this is precisely where Silicon Valley invests. So it's businesses where, or technologies where during a few years, they look like they're growing, of course, but they are following a quite static approach. And then suddenly, boom, the revenues, the technology, the usage, the adoption, etc., all of this gets multiplied by 10. And this is what we call the explosive bets. It's like a hockey stick. It's just very flat at the beginning, and then boom, suddenly it goes up, multiplied by 10. And this is the type of phenomena, or this is the type of companies and technologies where Silicon Valley is dramatically interested. Question is this far away from what we usually do? So let me see how these. Let me share how this connects with what we do every day in science. So basically, the reason for this explosive effect can be seen on those 3 examples to the right. So every 10 years, we are able to get 1 billion users to adopt a product. So for example, WhatsApp or Facebook, it took them less than 10 years to get from zero, from scratch, from this where they started, to getting 1 billion users adoption. So 1 billion people in the world using that product, which is pretty amazing. But that's kind of the phenomena. So type of businesses, technologies that Silicon Valley is using are those that have this network effect, this platform effect, where we have massive amount of users who are going to be starting to adopt that product, are going to be sharing with everybody and kind of, in a way, evangelizing other users to get into the platform. And that's what we do when we sign up for Facebook and we invited our friends. So we did the same with WhatsApp and we start chatting with some other people. So we gain this user adoption by kind of putting everybody together. Then let's look more at the technological side. So in this case, we're starting to talk about something that is data. So all the things that change that quickly is mobile data traffic. So we are all using our smartphones. We are looking for more and more information. We're doing more and more things. And this is basically bringing a 100 times mobile data traffic. So we are increasing the data traffic by 100 times. So this is kind of the same effect that 10 times we were talking about. And then there are technologies. So for example, computing power in the last decade has increased by 1,000. So there is some physical effects that help us shrink the microprocessors and get more and more computing power out of silicon. And this is just a physical effect. It's all the nanotechnology that we are applying is helping us increase the computing power and creating all the devices that we do. So those are 3 examples of what we call explosive bets or explosive opportunities, because those technologies or those user networks help us or have a similar behavior to the one we are seeing at company level. So this is very similar to that. So where could we be finding this phenomena in our everyday basis? So I'm sure that most of you are working on technologies that have this potential. And in fact, we can connect 3 different things. So where can we find these opportunities? So there are basically 3 Ds where we can find these opportunities. And starting with D number 1 is in demographics. So those of you who are working on social sciences, you're probably seeing trends. They're taking this approach. So we look, for example, at the population of Africa. Is expected by the year 2100 to have followed this approach, and the population is going to be multiplying versus population in other areas of the world where it's going to be stagnant. So that's one example where in social science we can find this type of exponential or explosive effects. There is as well the, if I go to the right, there is the data aspect. So we're talking about the mobile. So mobile data has multiplied by 100 over the past 10 years. It will be multiplied by 100 in a decade. So if we look at how the satellite costs are going down, and they're basically following the same trend in terms of lowering the cost, we're going to be seeing an even more massive explosion of data, because we'll have satellites in regions where we don't have internet penetration. So we look at Africa, for example, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of networks, it's a little bit more difficult. But if we look, for example, at using satellite technology, we can cover areas where there is no internet connection. And then there's the other aspect, which is the democratization. So there's other things where costs are being lowered, such as, for example, in terms of how we diagnose health issues, how we diagnose, how do we do like medicine with lower costs. So if you combine all these different things, is where you find these explosive effects, and you can build any other type of companies. We have here a question I'm going to be reading. So in all these cases, Google, SpaceX, and all the other very well-known companies today. And there are very, very few that actually made it this far with such a dramatic success. So the question is it fair to generalize or to take them as if it was just a regular example? So that's a very valid question, and absolutely things can be put in perspective. What I can tell you from my experience is that working, for example, at Google, I work regularly with other tech companies, smaller tech companies, and we did see the same effect. maybe the scale is not going to be like billions. So I agree that there are only a few that are making hundreds of billions in terms of annual revenue. But kind of the process that they follow is very similar. And to give you a few examples, in my current company or other companies that work on the software arena, we can see an ecosystem of companies that are as well exploding, and they're growing very, very fast. So, and that ecosystem around those large companies is very healthy. So in this case, I'm sure that if you go to the App Store, you can find hundreds of apps, and there are many of them that are very successful and doing multi-million revenues. If we go as well to the cloud ecosystem where I'm working, there are as well tons of companies from hardware to software that are being very, very successful, and I'm part of this large ecosystem. The same happens in my experience with Google, and if you go to Silicon Valley, that's precisely the interesting thing, is that, of course, there's these few layers, but there's a network of companies that are being as well as successful. And kind of the recipe, and that's what I'm trying to share here, is that they try to look for this combination of three things that are explosive, and when you put them together, that cocktail is what brings that company up into that space. Of course, there's going to be a few big players, but there is going to be as well many, many, many small players that are going to be successful, at least in my experience. And please keep asking if there are any more questions. So to close on the explosive bets, we covered the effect. We covered what things, what are the 3Ds that bring us to this kind of explosive effect. But one area that we have not looked into is how technology, how science behind is driving this. And I'm presenting this from the perspective of horizons of technology, since all of us are working on science and maybe are saying, well, is the area I'm working in gonna become a super major company in a few years? So there is a framework that most of the companies use, and you can have a look if you're interested. You can Google it, which is the Gartner Hype Cycle. So what they do is they assess technologies and they see, well, how ready they are to become mainstream, to be used by everybody. That's what we call the years to mainstream. And you have different horizons. It could be from 2 to 5 years to be ready for a commercial success, or it could be from 5 to 10 years or 10 years plus. So this gives us the horizon in terms of how ready those technologies are to become a company and to be disrupting the marketplace. But the other dimension that they are looking into is, regardless of how far they are, is how they are perceived by the market. Because basically, one of the things that at least I had in my experience when I was working in science is I was working on a specific technology, and then I realized that that technology was getting a lot of traction, and then transforming that into the business probably took a bit longer than what we all expected. And probably you're all hearing things like drones or blockchain or autonomous cars. So there are many different technologies that currently they're in the media, and probably this is part of some of your research. There are many other technologies. I've only covered mostly the digital ones, but this could be encompassing all the different technology, science, and research that we are doing. That, hey, this is in the news. Maybe I'm coming late to start my own company because everybody's talking about it. So one of the effects that we see, and they try to capture in this hype cycle, is that there are technologies that they are not ready for the market. So they are going to be ready in 10 years' time or in 5 years' time. However, everybody's talking about them. And this is what we call the false starts. So every technology goes through a cycle where we are in the lab, we are researching, we are taking the technology forward. And there's a few people who decide to, okay, let's try to build a company around it. There is already people in the market who are excited to test it, to try, to start doing things with it. And this has happened, for example, with the blockchain technology. Currently, everybody's talking about Bitcoin and all the prices going up. But this technology probably is going to be more impactful 5 years, 10 years down the road. There is already an application. We don't know whether it will become a mainstream thing or not. That's the reason why we call it like fast start, like the big question mark, is that going to be successful or not? But the interesting thing is whomever is working on cryptography or quantum computers, etc., this technology is going to become mainstream further down the road. So you are not arriving late. And this is the framework that is used by Gartner, and I try to capture here is when you are doing research, try to think how many years are down the road to becoming mainstream. There are many different studies like the one I'm referring to or some others that can give us the kind of a commercial gap until it becomes mainstream. And then on the other hand is how the market is perceiving it. And the road from the lab to adoption usually goes through at least one cycle of, let's say, false starts or early adopters who find a first use case or a first application. But this is a good case, and this is what fuels the main adoption. And we have seen the examples, the companies we were talking about before, they have all gone, their technologies have all gone through these different use cases until they found the massive one that brought to a majority of adoption. So before I move into the next topic, my question here is the research you are working on today, in what of these different stages of maturity do you think it is? It's already in adoption? Do you think it's more still in the lab? Or is there some things that you're doing that we can find examples of all the starts? Okay, so while we post all these different questions, let me move into the next topic. So we have talked about ideas. We have talked about major vision, something that guides us. We have talked about how this vision connects to an opportunity. At the end of the day, we have a big idea. We want to change the world. We're going to maybe go to the to Mars or to other stars. And where is the technology that is available? And that's what we are going to be picking to build a business. But now the third thing is, how do we take concrete steps to bring those ideas to reality? And this is what these companies, for what these companies use a framework that help us focus innovation. So in the vision, what we try to have is kind of this idealistic, moving concept of what we want to do. But what we are going to be taking to bring them to reality, we start asking ourselves a few examples. So this is in the tech companies I've been working for. This is kind of how we set objectives on a regular basis. So whenever, for example, I'm doing this right now with my team, we are trying to build the objectives for the year. Our fiscal year started in early February. So this month we are kind of focusing on what is our vision for the year and what do we want to accomplish. And basically that's where we start with. We start with certain objectives. So how do we break down that vision into specific objectives that we can all accomplish, that we can all achieve? So that's the first step. And once we have defined them, then is what we get to is how do we intend to do it? So what we need to be accomplished is where's the problems that we need to solve to get to that vision. And then the next step is how do we do them? How do we fix those problems? How do we take action to get to the state we want to be in? And of course, we need to answer as well, how will you know that this team is getting there? So what we do is with this document is we make it public, and eventually you could be able to see that kind of a statement of what we intend to do, and you will be coming back and saying, well, is this team doing what they intended to do or not? So here's the thing about the outcome piece, is that it's a public way of saying this is what I'm committing to do it, and this is how I'm going to be measuring that I'm going to be doing it. And that way you will be able to see whether we got there or not. An important thing here is that we are not graded. So we grade the objective because we want to make sure that we at least try it. But we are not graded on the outcome. We are mostly graded on trying things. And that's as well one of the approaches, the cultural approaches of Silicon Valley companies, is that you want to try things. And the way of trying them is through an activity and an outcome. And if you don't get to the outcome, well, that's what is called failure. But at least we have a framework for bringing all these ideas into reality. So this is the overall framework. I'm going to be moving now into an example based on one of the companies that we just saw to try to bring it to down to earth. So in the example of SpaceX, we want to go to Mars. We want to be like a multiplanetary species. So what are the things that we need to accomplish to go to Mars, basically? So there are three things that the company should be doing. They should be settling with a permanent base camp. It's like going to Everest. You need, before going to the summit, you need to have a base camp where you can refuel, where you can prepare for that long journey. So that's what they call, well, we need to have a permanent settlement at low Earth orbit. So that's one of the objectives. If you don't have it, you cannot go that far. The second one is you need to reduce cost. At the moment, sending someone to the moon, the average price tag is $1 billion. So every person we send outside the atmosphere takes around $1 billion. So either you reduce the cost, or it won't be possible to send a lot of people. We won't have the money to democratize these trips. So basically, we need to find a way to reduce those costs. But of course, we need to do it with reliability. I don't think that anyone will be approving going to Mars with in a vehicle that doesn't support this. And then the last thing is you need spacecraft. You need vehicles that help you carry more astronauts and farther away, which is, we don't have neither of the three. So this is kind of the base of what needs to be accomplished to get to that vision of going to Mars and going beyond even the solar system. So how do we get here? So that's the activities. So for example, how do you achieve a permanent settlement? So then what you need to do is delivering or kind of helping the International Space Station be supplied. That way you can have permanent settlement because you're always sending cargo, you're sending supplies to the International Space Station to become a permanent settlement. And that's, for example, how as well the Antarctica works. They keep bases because they are sending supplies every now and then. So in this case, the outcome is throughout, let's say, if this is a plan for the next 2 years, so maybe it's 100 resupply missions need to be carried out. That's how I'm going to be measuring that I'm keeping the supply in the International Space Station. So that's one example of how this works. Let's move into another example. So if we want to carry more astronauts, one of the things that we need to do is we need to redesign the spacecraft that we have today. So the way to the activities that we need to do in the company is designing, manufacturing, and even launching advanced spacecraft. And how I'm going to be measuring it? Well, whenever I've been able to prove that I have a more powerful rocket than what I have today, which is, for example, the Falcon Heavy, which was tested the other day. So those are examples on how we could be translating what an innovative company is doing into a concrete plan to bring ideas to reality. So we have a question here. Isn't the ecosystem in Silicon Valley very specific? So again, the idea of, or kind of the essentials that I'm sharing are things that, at least in my experience, I haven't seen in many other companies. And those kind of recipes help fuel some of this innovation and some of this success. Of course, there are some specific things about Silicon Valley that are not replicable. I mean, the density of innovative companies in the same place, the access to funds. There are many, many different things that are non-replicable. But at least what, in my experience, is that bringing those things to our day-to-day has some results. So, for example, all the Silicon Valley companies go and expand somewhere else. So, I had experience here in Europe working with those companies, and we bring some of the Silicon Valley culture, and it certainly has effects in terms of accelerating businesses. We acquire companies innovative companies in Europe, and we help fuel as well the ecosystem around us, and we see that translating those best practices has an effect. That's what I can say from my experience. Of course, it's very, very difficult to generalize. There is another question, and is whether universities around Silicon Valley are adopting any of these companies' lessons learned, and whether it has been effective. Well, I don't know in detail all the different universities or research centers, what they are doing, but certainly, for example, who is very predominant in the Valley, and that's Stanford University. I know that they have a specific departments and areas that are following some of these best practices, and in fact, even some of these departments help invent and discover that these different best practices would be working. So certainly, I don't know across the board how it's working on the scientific and academic community, but I would say that some of this permeates into the this community. Another example is NASA has facilities in the Valley. They used to have an airdrome, and they have settled in NASA exponential lab, where they are both building startups and they are having partnerships with companies to develop specific technologies and businesses. So some of this permeates as well into the academia and scientific community. And the last thing about the Valley is that they have the breakthrough prizes. I don't know what you are having following them, but for example, they usually run on December, and they bring together the scientific community back to the Valley to reward and recognize all those scientists around the world who have made a massive contribution according to their criteria. So this is as well a good way of celebrating and cherishing and connecting academia and science with the Valley. So before we move from this section, what I'll be asking is whether you want to share any of the objectives that you have for this year, for this 2018, that you would like to maybe share with everybody. What are those objectives? What are the key activities that are going to be driving you, and whether you have a metric that measures it? If you have a few examples that you want to share, that'd be nice. So I'll give you a few seconds to share. Okay, so we are moving into the last sections of the essentials. So now we're going to be moving more into the culture piece on these companies. So how they work in terms of values, etc. So another piece of recipe, and I think that this is coming on the probably the other way around. This is probably coming from science into those tech companies, is the cooperation, the transparency, the teamwork values that we find in our community. What we see, what is visible, probably this is what most people see, is the ping pong tables, or all the open source projects that have been around. I mean, Linux was one example of a massive open source project that has become alive in its own, is what is powering the kernels at most of our smartphones. So those are examples of things that have been set up in a scientific or in a community aspect. And another thing that is very, very visible is that people in those companies try to bring their peers, colleagues whom they have worked with to those companies. So these are the things that are visible. When we see Silicon Valley, we see all these different fancy offices, etc., and what people are doing. But what is behind the scenes? What does it mean? So those are at least the values that those companies try to bring in the teams. So first of all is the transparency. So most of the communications or all the communications default to open. So we share everything very openly. So for example, in my team here, we have a similar to a Google Doc. We have something that's called Quip. It's a tool where we share all the information and we just share things similar to what if you have used or you use Slack. So we use a lot of messaging and we broadcast everything to everybody, so you can have access everything. There is no kind of a secret folder. So any plans the company has, any products the company is going to be launching, anything that is going to be like the open public doesn't know, but we kind of impacts the future of the company is made public and is shared by everybody. Things as well that are commons is, for example, when I was working for Google, we had every Friday something called Thanks God It's Friday, the TGIF, where it was a kind of similar to an all hands, where top management of the company, founders were coming down and saying, hey, what are the big things that we have accomplished this week, and celebrating them and sharing very openly what is in the store for all of us. So that's one point. Another point is the collaboration. So it tends to work in really small empowered teams. That's one of the things that I kind of liked when I transitioned into tech from science, is that seeing these small teams where you are autonomous and you can work on with quite a relative autonomy. So this is related to things that we see, the office space. There are a few things that are funny around it, which is kind of something that is called the pizza rule that they have in one of the companies, where they try to bring teams together that you could be feeding with a pizza. So basically, really small teams, 5-6 people who can operate autonomously and kind of change things on their own. Then all the collaboration tools that we were just discussing that help exchange ideas very, very quickly and have this freedom to decide. So that's another thing that we are seeing as one of the core values in teamwork. And last piece is the feedback. So in this culture, in this environment, we try to promote kind of learning. So from our colleagues, we get regular peer-to-peer feedback, so that helps you improve. So after a presentation, maybe someone, we have a feedback app, but it could be as well via email or face-to-face. Like we give each other feedback in terms of, hey, you could have improved this, or you could have been done this differently, and that helps you improve for the next time, and you grow. You grow with the business, you grow with the environment, and this is an excellent opportunity to get different points of view. And on the other hand, this helps as well for this kind of freedom where everyone can basically organize their time, etc. You can get as well this responsibility and reliability, because as a team, we cannot fail. So I'm going to be asking everybody as well another question, which is on the values. Where is your top value for teamwork? Which is the value that you like the most, you apply the most, and if you could share it with everybody. So the last essential is the customer obsession. And I know that in research, in science, maybe the word customer doesn't necessarily apply to our everyday, because we are we are not actually selling anything. But from the perspective of these companies, even if we look at it from the technology perspective, the approach, and I use the word customer, but in reality, the approach is the user. So what those companies want to make sure about the technology is that it helps democratize things. So when we're talking about the vision, is how do we make sure that it reaches out as many people as possible? And this is kind of the customer obsession. So whenever you're working on a technology that is going to be changing dramatically the life of many, many, many people, this is already a customer obsession. Is connecting a technology with some user needs. So basically, this is connecting these two worlds, and that's what the customer obsession is. And by reaching that, there is a multiplier effect. So just to close on the customer obsession, I want to share with you one example, which is of a public company I've been working with in a project, and just some of the metrics that we look in terms of when we talk about the customer obsession. So how do we measure that we have created this user experience, that we have made this approach, and what has been the impact from the business perspective? So, for example, we are talking about now it has become an e-commerce company, but it was a manufacturer of some goods, and the customers were completely were not interacting at all with the company. They were completely disconnected. The website was with very limited functionality, and there was not that close interaction. So with technology, and in this case it's just web technology, what the project allowed is to be closer to the customer by having through data a more connected, a more personalized experience, where based on the information that the user was able to provide, we were able to help that company get closer to the customer, understand what they needed, and give predictive recommendations. So we are using behind technology like predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, things like that, to personalize the experience and make it as close as possible to what the user will like. So before we move on, another question is there any of the technologies, any of the research you're doing that you think can have an immediate massive impact in everybody's life? Anything that could help democratize something? If you want to share, that'd be amazing. So we are reaching the end of the webinar. So let's wrap up. What we have seen today is basically three things in this hour. So I've seen how Silicon Valley companies operate. So those are kind of some of the inside things of what they do. The second thing we have reviewed is some of the success factors that those companies use to scale a technology to make it successful. And the last thing is some innovation frameworks that could be useful for your everyday research. So we have a few minutes left. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them via the YouTube channel or Twitter. Thanks for the answers on the teamwork values. I'm going to be reading them. I think they're very, very nice. Respect, dedication, collaboration with autonomy, no micromanagement, brilliant. Responsibility, continuous improvement, trust each other. Wonderful. And I think that this is precisely one of the things that these companies try to do. And this is one of the things that fuels innovation. And again, I think that in this case, we probably know more in science, or we tend to do it pretty well. But just to let you know, or reinforce the message that this is what creates innovative spaces. Okay, so it's time to wrap up the webinar. So if you have any further questions, please, again, use the channels that we have available to connect. So thank you very much for attending. It was really a pleasure, and thanks for the interactions. I think that made it really useful, I hope, for everybody. After the webinar, we'll be sharing via email a link to the YouTube recording, and there will be as well a link to a Google Doc with the slides. There will be shortly another webinar at the end of March, so please stay tuned for the next one. Again, thank you very much for attending, and have a lovely rest of your week.